The cargo bay was slick with coolant and blood, and the pirate captain stared at the quiet human passenger in sheer terror. They thought he was an easy mark. They didn't know the scars beneath his collar belonged to Earth's most classified Black Ops division. They just locked themselves in with a monster. Port Tantalus smelled of ozone, spilled promethium fuel, and the desperate sweat of 1,000 different species trying to scrape a living on the edge of civilized space. It was a miserable, rusted station hanging in the shadow of a dying red dwarf, serving as the last semi-legal jumping-off point before the Vesper Traverse. Kevin Marshall sat at a corner table in the station's most wretched cantina, nursing a mug of lukewarm synth-caf. He was a decidedly unremarkable man. Average height, graying neatly at the temples, wearing a faded wool surplus coat and a pair of scuffed leather boots. His face was lined with the kind of deep, quiet exhaustion that came from a lifetime of hard labor, or hard choices. In a room filled with towering reptilian enforcers, cybernetically enhanced smugglers, and four-armed dock workers, the human looked entirely out of place. He looked fragile, and for the past 3 days, nobody would give him passage. "I told you, Terran, we don't take your kind on the redemption," spat a heavy-set captain, his skin a mottled bruised purple. "Humans are too much political baggage. The outer systems don't like Earth's trade policies, and I'm not getting my cargo seized because some port authority wants to make an example out of my passenger manifest. Go find a luxury liner." Kevin didn't argue. He simply nodded, his face betraying no emotion, and retrieved his datapad. He had been rejected by 12 ships. The bias against humans in the outer rims was a well-documented reality. Following the Orion Accords, Earth had disarmed its expeditionary fleets, pivoting entirely to bureaucracy, diplomacy, and trade. To the hardened denizens of the frontier, humanity had become synonymous with softness. They were perceived as litigious, fragile creatures who hid behind treaties and corporate lawyers. Kevin took a sip of his bitter coffee and consulted his list. There was one ship left in the dockyard that was heading toward the new Calum colony, the Corsica, a Class 4 bulk hauler that had failed its last 3 safety inspections. Half an hour later, Kevin stood on the oil-stained gantry of Docking Bay 4, watching sparks rain down from the Corsica's primary thruster housing. A frantic man in a grease-stained jumpsuit was screaming at a loading drone. This was Captain Reginald Cobb. "Captain Cobb!" Kevin's voice was calm, baritone, and completely steady. Cobb spun around, wiping grease from his forehead, revealing a face lined with stress and poor dietary choices. "Who's asking? If you're from the Port Authority, the fines are in arbitration." "I'm looking for passage to New Calum," Kevin said, holding his duffel bag by his side. "I was told you're departing within the solar cycle." Cobb let out a harsh, barking laugh. He looked Kevin up and down, taking in the gray hair and the worn coat. "A human? Out here? Look, pal, the Traverse ain't a tourist route. It's 6 weeks of magnetic storms, pirate territories, and deep space paranoia. My ship ain't a cruise liner. I don't have life support calibrated for your specific atmospheric needs, and I sure as hell don't have a med bay when your delicate bone structure snaps under high G maneuvers." Kevin reached into the deep pocket of his coat. Cobb's hand immediately drifted toward the heavy kinetic pistol holstered at his hip, a reflex born of the frontier. But Kevin simply produced a small, dense lockbox. He keyed the biometric thumbprint, and the lid hissed open. Inside rested 4 heavy, perfectly milled ingots of weapon-grade palladium. Cobb's breath hitched. In the outer rim, that much palladium could buy a new ship, let alone passage on a dying one. I don't need a med bay, Kevin said quietly. I need a bunk, a pressurized cabin, and for you to ignore the fact that I am on board. 3 ingots upon boarding. The 4th when we touch down at New Calem. Cobb swallowed hard. He was drowning in debt, and the local syndicate was threatening to repossess his kneecaps if he didn't pay up by next month. His eyes darted to his first mate, Griggs, a hulking brute of a man with synthetic optical implants, who had just walked down the loading ramp. Griggs stared at the metal, then nodded slowly to Cobb. Fine, Cobb muttered, snapping the box shut. You get cabin 4. It's next to the primary coolant lines. It's loud, it's freezing, and it smells like ammonia. Breakfast is synthetic protein mash at 0800 hours. You stay out of the way, you don't talk to my crew, and you don't touch anything. Understood, Kevin said. For the first 2 weeks of the voyage, Kevin Marshall was practically a ghost. He adhered strictly to Cobb's rules. He spent 22 hours a day in his freezing, cramped cabin. When he did venture out to the mess hall, he ate his gray protein mash in absolute silence. The crew of the Corsica treated him with open disdain. Griggs would intentionally shoulder-check Kevin in the narrow corridors, trying to provoke a reaction. Kevin would simply stumble, lower his head, murmur a quiet apology, and keep walking. Torres, the ship's engineer, openly mocked him during meals, loudly complaining about the earthling dead weight dragging down their life support efficiency. Kevin never responded. In the privacy of cabin 4, beneath the deafening hum of the coolant lines, he read dog-eared paperback copies of ancient philosophy. He maintained a rigorous, silent calisthenics routine, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that no one on the ship ever witnessed. He was a man suspended in time, counting down the days until he could see his estranged daughter on New Calem, the only tether he had left to his own humanity. But out in the Vesper Traverse, peace is a luxury that no one can afford for long. The Vesper Traverse was a sprawling, chaotic graveyard of shattered planetoids and residual magnetic interference. It was a region of space where deep space communication arrays went deaf, and navigation computers had to rely on manual telemetry. It was also the prime hunting ground for the bloodhound corsairs. On the 18th day of the voyage, the Corsica was navigating a particularly dense asteroid cluster when the ship violently shuddered. In cabin 4, Kevin was knocked from his bunk. The lights flickered, died, and were instantly replaced by the sickening crimson glow of the emergency bulkheads. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines whined into a high-pitched scream before dying out completely. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying. On the bridge, Captain Cobb was frantically hammering his console. "Talk to me, Torres. What just happened? Did we blow a relay?" Torres's voice came through the comms, panicked and breathless. "It wasn't a relay, Cap. We've been hit by an EMP snare wire. Someone strung a localized electromagnetic web between the rocks. The primary drive is fused. We're drifting." "Who the hell strings a snare wire out here?" Griggs demanded, his synthetic eyes whirring as he tried to recalibrate the optical sensors. "Look at the scanners," Cobb yelled, his face draining of color. A massive shadow detached itself from the surface of a nearby asteroid. Thermal cloaking panels deactivated, revealing a heavily armored frigate. It was painted pitch black, bristling with kinetic mass driver cannons and magnetic harpoons. Emblazoned on the hull was a crude, dripping white skull. "The bloodhound," Cobb whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. The comms console crackled to life. A voice, smooth and dripping with sadistic confidence, filled the bridge. "Freighter Corsica, this is Kalen Garrus. You have tripped my wire, which means you are now my property. Jettison your weapon systems, cut your localized gravity by half, and prepare to be boarded. If I detect a single thermal spike from your defense grid, I will ventilate your hull and scrape your frozen remains off my windshield." Cobb's hands shook. He knew the reputation of Kalen Garrus. Garrus didn't just rob ships. He operated a brutal slave trade in the Outer Rims, selling captured crews to subterranean mining colonies where the life expectancy was measured in months. "Captain, we have to fight," Griggs growled, unholstering a heavy plasma cutter. "With what?" Cobb screamed. "The EMP fried the targeting matrix. We are a cargo ship, Griggs, not a dreadnought. If we fight, we die right here. If we surrender, maybe I can buy our lives with the cargo. Stand down. That's an order." With a trembling hand, Cobb initiated the docking sequence overrides. A heavy metallic thud reverberated through the hull as the pirate frigate's boarding tube latched onto the Corsica's main airlock. The hiss of equalizing pressure was followed by the deafening boom of breaching charges blowing the inner doors off their hinges. They poured into the ship like a plague of locusts. 24 pirates, clad in scavenged heavy combat armor. They wielded brutal kinetic scatterguns and wicked serrated monomolecular blades. They moved with the practiced efficiency of apex predators, kicking in doors, screaming orders, and pistol whipping anyone who moved too slowly. Cobb, Griggs, Torres, and the remaining 6 crew members were dragged into the central mess hall and forced to their knees. Griggs had tried to take a swing at one of the boarders, and in response, a towering pirate had shattered his jaw with the butt of a rifle, leaving him bleeding and gasping on the metal floor deck. Kalen Garrus walked into the mess hall. He was a tall, lean man with pale skin and a network of glowing cybernetic neural laces weaving up his neck. He wore a tailored armored long coat and carried a beautifully engraved kinetic revolver. "Captain Cobb," Garrus said pleasantly, walking over and tapping the barrel of his revolver against Cobb's forehead. "A pleasure, truly." "Take the cargo," Cobb pleaded, his voice cracking. "The hold is full of refined lithium and medical supplies. It's yours. Just let us take the escape pods." Garrus chuckled, pacing in front of the kneeling crew. "Oh, I'll be taking the cargo, Reginald. But lithium is cheap right now. Organic labor, however, is trading at a premium. The spice mines on Tartarus 6 are currently paying top credit for healthy, strong workers." He looked down at the crew in disgust. "Though looking at this miserable lot, I might have to offer a discount." Garrus's second in command, a scarred veteran named Hackett, stepped forward, holding the Corsica's digital manifest. "Boss, the manifest says there are 10 souls on board. There's only 9 here." Garrus stopped pacing. His eyes narrowed. "Captain Cobb, did you misplace someone?" Cobb's eyes went wide. In the chaos, he had completely forgotten about the human in cabin 4. He's just a passenger, a human. He's harmless. He stays in his room down by the coolant lines." Garrus threw his head back and laughed. "A human? Out here? Oh, this is a banner day. Humans are weak, but they look pretty. The syndicates pay double for Terran exotics." Garrus waved his hand at 2 heavily armed pirates near the door. "Dax, Reimer, go down to the lower decks. Fetch me the Terran. Try not to bruise his face. But if he whines, break his legs, we can always drag him." The two pirates grinned, racking the slides of their weapons, and disappeared down the corridor. Cobb closed his eyes. He felt a pang of guilt. The quiet old man was about to be dragged into a living hell, and there was nothing Cobb could do about it. The lower decks were shrouded in shadows, the emergency red lighting casting long, jagged silhouettes against the bulkheads. The air was freezing here, thick with the smell of ammonia and ozone. Dax and Reimer stomped down the metal grating, not bothering to mask their approach. Why would they? They were hunting a human. "Cabin 4, Dax grunted, checking the faded numerals on the heavy steel doors. He didn't bother using the access panel. He just raised his heavy combat boot and kicked the locking mechanism, shattering the cheap magnetic seal. The door slid open with a screech. Inside the tiny, freezing cabin, Kevin Marshall was standing by his bunk. He had his faded wool coat on, and he was calmly zipping up his duffel bag. He looked up as the two massive, armored pirates entered, his expression one of mild, pathetic confusion. "Well, look at this," Reimer sneered, leveling his scattergun at Kevin's chest. "The little earthling is packing his bags. Were you going somewhere, Grandpa?" Kevin took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of total surrender. His hands were shaking visibly. "Please," Kevin said, his voice trembling perfectly. "I don't have anything of value. Just let me stay here." Dax laughed, stepping into the room and violently shoving Kevin against the bulkhead. Kevin let out a gasp, slumping down the wall and dropping his bag. He looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly defeated. "Shut up, meat," Dax spat. He turned his head to speak into his shoulder comms. "Hey, boss, we got him. He's a pathetic old bag of bones. We're bringing him up." Kevin stayed slumped against the wall. His eyes, completely hidden by the shadows of the room, stared at the floor. Distance, 2 feet. Armor type, scavenged ablative plating, vulnerable at the joints and neck. Weapons, close quarters scattergun, slung low, kinetic sidearm, holstered on the right thigh. In military tactical theory, there is a concept known as the OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. It is the cognitive process of combat. The side that processes this cycle the fastest wins the engagement. Dax and Reimer were currently in a state of complete relaxation, their OODA loops sluggish and clouded by arrogance. They perceived an old, terrified man. They were wrong. Dax reached down to grab Kevin by the collar. The shift was so sudden, so violently explosive, that Dax's brain didn't even register the movement until it was over. Kevin's hand shot upward, not in a wild punch, but a surgically precise strike. His fingers gripped a solid titanium tactical pen he had slipped from his pocket. He drove it upward, bypassing Dax's armored chest plate, directly into the soft, unprotected tissue beneath the jawline. Dax didn't even have time to scream. His eyes bulged as his nervous system instantly shut down, blood spraying across the red-lit walls. Before Dax's lifeless body even began to fall, Kevin used the pirate's dropping weight as an anchor, launching himself sideways. Reimer's eyes widened in shock, his brain desperately trying to understand why his partner was suddenly bleeding out. He raised his scattergun, his finger twitching toward the trigger. Kevin closed the gap in a fraction of a second. His left hand clamped down on the barrel of the scattergun, forcefully redirecting it toward the ceiling. As the gun discharged with a deafening roar, blowing a hole in the ship's coolant pipes, Kevin's right hand formed a rigid blade. He stepped into Reimer's guard and delivered a crushing, kinetic strike to the pirate's larynx. There was a sickening crunch. Reimer dropped the gun, clutching his ruined throat, gagging on his own blood. Kevin didn't pause to watch him die. With ruthless efficiency, he swept Reimer's leg, sending the heavy pirate crashing to the metal floor. Kevin placed his boot squarely on Reimer's neck and pressed down until the thrashing stopped. Total elapsed time, 4.2 seconds. The room fell silent, save for the hissing of the ruptured coolant line. Kevin stood over the two corpses. The trembling old man was gone. His posture was perfectly straight, his eyes cold, calculating, and devoid of any human empathy. He reached down and unclipped the heavy kinetic sidearm from Dax's holster. He checked the magazine, chambered a round, and slipped an extra thermal grenade from Reimer's belt into his coat pocket. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt, rolling up his right sleeve to keep the blood off the fabric. As he did, the emergency lights caught the faded black ink tattooed on his inner forearm, a shattered human skull, entirely engulfed in the flames of a burning earth. Kevin stepped over the bodies and walked out into the corridor. He didn't run. He moved with the silent, terrifying prowl of an apex predator that had just been let off its leash. Up in the Corsica's main server room, 3 pirates were busy ripping out the valuable quantum processing cores from the ship's mainframe. They were joking, their weapons slung lazily over their shoulders. The lights in the server room suddenly died, plunging the space into absolute pitch blackness. "Hey, who cut the feed?" one of the pirates shouted, slapping the side of his helmet to activate his thermal optics. Before the optic could boot up, a heavy metallic wrench, thrown with lethal velocity from the darkness, smashed into his visor, caving in the reinforced glass, and his skull with it. He dropped like a stone. "Contact!" the second pirate screamed, raising his rifle and firing blindly into the dark. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room in strobe-like bursts. For a fraction of a second, the pirate saw a man in a gray coat standing completely still, leaning casually against a server rack directly to his left. Before the pirate could adjust his aim, 2 suppressed shots rang out. Pft, pft. 2 neat, perfectly placed holes appeared in the center of the pirate's thermal visor. He collapsed backwards. The third pirate panicked. He threw his gun away, turned, and sprinted for the door. He made it exactly 3 steps before a heavy boot kicked the back of his knee, blowing out the joint. As the pirate screamed and fell to the deck, a cold, calloused hand grabbed him by the hair, violently jerking his head back. The cold steel of a pistol barrel was pressed directly against the base of his skull. "Comms channel," a deep, terrifyingly calm voice whispered in his ear. "What frequency is your captain on?" "Go to hell, Terran," the pirate spat. Kevin didn't argue. He shifted the pistol an inch to the right and pulled the trigger, blowing off the pirate's ear. The man shrieked in agony, thrashing on the floor. Channel 4, please God, stop!" Kevin brought the gun back to the base of the skull. "Thank you." He pulled the trigger again. On the bridge of the Bloodhound, Kalen Garris was sitting in the captain's chair, filing his nails, waiting for his men to bring up the human. Hackett, his scarred second in command, was monitoring the external security feeds from the Corsica. Hackett frowned. "Boss, I just lost telemetry on Dax and Reimer in the lower decks. Their vitals flatlined." Garris stopped filing his nails. "Flatlined? Did they trip a booby trap?" "Negative," Hackett said, his fingers flying across the console, pulling up the internal security cameras of the Corsica. "I'm checking the server room. Team 2 just went offline as well." Hackett pulled up the grainy, low-light feed from the server room corridor. The camera was damaged, filled with static, but it caught a few frames of movement. A man walking out of the server room. He was holding a kinetic pistol in a perfect low-ready tactical stance. As the man passed under a flickering emergency light, he reached up to adjust the earpiece he had stolen from a dead pirate. The camera zoomed in, catching a high-resolution freeze frame of his bare right forearm. Hackett stared at the monitor. The blood slowly drained from his face. His hands began to shake violently. "Hackett?" Garrus asked, noticing his lieutenant's sudden terror. "What is it? A stowaway Marine?" Hackett swallowed, his mouth completely dry. During the border wars, Hackett had fought on the front lines. He had seen the things the Earth Coalition deployed when diplomacy failed. He had heard the ghost stories. "Boss," Hackett whispered, his voice trembling as he pointed at the shattered skull tattoo on the screen. That's not a Marine. That's a Wraith." Garrus stood up. "A what?" "A Wraith," Hackett repeated, genuine panic bleeding into his voice. "Earth's Apex Division, 0G Close Quarters Specialists. They were supposed to be disbanded after the Kara's siege. They are off-the-books assassins. They don't take prisoners, Garrus. They dismantle entire ships from the inside out." Garrus scoffed, trying to maintain his bravado. "He's one man, Hackett. I have 30 heavily armed killers on that ship." Suddenly, the ship-wide intercom system on both the Bloodhound and the Corsica crackled to life. Static hissed through the speakers, followed by a calm, even, baritone voice. "Kalen Garrus." Down in the mess hall, Captain Cobb and his crew looked up at the speakers in shock. They recognized that quiet voice. "You have boarded a vessel under my temporary protection." Kevin Marshall's voice echoed through the metal corridors, entirely devoid of anger, fear, or emotion. "You have murdered members of this crew. I am no longer a passenger." On the bridge of the pirate ship, Hackett took a step back toward the escape pods. "You have exactly 60 seconds to abandon this ship," Kevin continued. "If you are still aboard when the timer reaches 0, I will not accept your surrender. Mark." The intercom clicked off. The 60-second countdown had begun. 45 seconds remained. On the bridge of the Bloodhound, Kalen Garrus slammed his fist onto the primary console, shattering the glass display. His face was contorted in a mix of absolute rage and creeping dread. "Nobody threatens me on a derelict hauler. All squads collapse on the lower decks. I want that Terran's head on a pike, and I want it now." He turned to issue a flanking order to his second-in-command, but the space beside him was empty. Hackett was already sprinting down the primary corridor toward the airlock, abandoning his captain without a second thought. Hackett had survived the border wars because he knew exactly what a Wraith was, a localized extinction event. 30 seconds remained. Deep within the bowels of the Corsica, a squad of 6 heavily armed corsairs, led by a cartel veteran named Bradley Hayes, stacked up outside the primary stairwell. Their thermal optics swept the freezing corridors. "Stay tight," Hayes ordered, his voice tight with anxiety. "Cover your sectors. He's just flesh and bone." The heavy steel blast doors of the stairwell suddenly slammed shut behind them, the magnetic locks engaging with a deafening clack. Before Hayes could swear, the localized gravity plating in the corridor instantly deactivated. The 6 pirates were violently ripped from the floor, floating helplessly in the zero-G environment. They flailed, their heavy armor suddenly a massive liability as they drifted out of formation. "He cut the grav generators," Hayes yelled, grabbing a ruptured pipe to anchor himself. "Check your ceilings." They didn't need to check the ceiling. Kevin Marshall was already among them. He hadn't dropped the gravity to disorient them. He dropped it because a Wraith is trained to fight in the 3-dimensional vacuum of deep space. Kevin pushed off the far bulkhead with terrifying velocity, a shadow darting through the weightless darkness. He didn't use a firearm. In zero-G, the kinetic recoil would alter his trajectory. Instead, he drew a carbon steel combat knife. Kevin collided with the first pirate, driving the blade through the vulnerable gap beneath the helmet's blast visor. Using the dead man's momentum, Kevin pivoted, kicking off the corpse's chest plate to launch himself at the next target. "Fire! Fire!" Hayes screamed, discharging his kinetic scattergun. The recoil instantly sent Hayes spinning violently backward, his shots tearing harmlessly through the ship's bulkheads. Kevin moved like water. He caught a second pirate around the neck with a length of reinforced synthetic tether, twisting his body to snap the man's cervical spine. He used the third pirate as a human shield against the panicked, friendly fire of the fourth, before burying his knife to the hilt in the shooter's chest. In less than 12 seconds, 5 men were dead, their bodies floating in a macabre, weightless ballet amidst drifting droplets of crimson blood. Hayes was the only one left. He had managed to anchor himself to a ceiling grate, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his weapon. He scanned the floating corpses, hyperventilating. The human was gone. A cold hand clamped around Hayes's ankle. Hayes screamed, aiming his gun downward, but Kevin forcefully jerked the pirate's leg, pulling him free from the grate. As Hayes tumbled through the air, Kevin caught him by the collar, pulling the terrified pirate face to face. Kevin's expression was a mask of terrifying, serene focus. "0," Kevin whispered. The 60 seconds were up. Kevin drove the knife upward. Up in the mess hall, Captain Cobb and the surviving crew of the Corsica huddled on the blood-stained floor. 4 pirates had been left behind to guard them, their weapons drawn, but their eyes were locked onto their comms monitors. They were listening to the slaughter. The pirate frequency was an open channel of pure horror. There were no gunfights. There were only bursts of static, panicked screams, the wet tearing of flesh, and then absolute silence. One by one, the life signs of Garrus's boarding party were blinking out on their tactical HUDs. "We need to get off this ship," one of the guards muttered, backing toward the mess hall doors. "Garrus is crazy. That's not a human down there. It's a demon." The mess hall intercom crackled. Kalen Garrus's voice echoed through the room, though his previous arrogance had entirely evaporated. He sounded frantic, breathless. "Hold the hostages. I'm coming to the mess hall. If that Terran wants to play ghost, we'll give him something to look at. Put a gun to the captain's head. If the human breaches the door, execute the crew." The 4 guards exchanged panicked glances, but they followed orders. 2 of them grabbed Cobb, hauling the bruised captain to his feet and pressing a plasma pistol directly against his temple. The others aimed their heavy rifles squarely at the reinforced main doors, waiting for the magnetic locks to cycle. They waited for a breach. They waited for the door to blow. They were looking the wrong way. Kevin Marshall did not use doors when his enemy was aiming at them. Directly beneath the mess hall deck was the primary ventilation and maintenance crawl space. Torres, the ship's engineer, knew it was only 3 feet of clearance, lined with high-voltage cabling. No human in heavy combat gear could navigate it quickly. But Kevin wasn't wearing armor. He was wearing a faded wool coat. A localized, blinding hiss of blue light suddenly erupted from the floor plating directly beneath the 2 pirates aiming at the door. Before their brains could process the thermal spike, a stolen plasma cutter sliced a perfect, yard-wide circle through the deck. The metal grating gave way. The 2 guards plummeted through the floor into the subdeck with a shout of surprise. The instant they dropped, Kevin vaulted upward through the newly created hole, moving with a terrifying, explosive kinetic energy. The 2 remaining guards, the ones holding Cobb hostage, spun around, their OODA loops completely shattered by the impossible angle of the attack. Kevin didn't give them a fraction of a second to recover. He raised the kinetic pistol he had taken from Dax and fired 2 shots in rapid succession, using a flawless center axis relock stance. Crack, crack. Both pirates dropped. Perfectly symmetrical bullet holes punched through the center of their visors. Silence descended on the mess hall. Captain Cobb collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The surviving crew stared at the man standing before them. Kevin's face was splattered with blood. His graying hair was matted with sweat. His eyes, usually cast downward in meek submission, were now locked onto the main corridor doors, burning with a cold, terrifying intensity. The main doors hissed open. Kalen Garris stepped into the mess hall, his kinetic revolver raised. He froze. He looked at the bodies of his elite guards, the hole in the floor, and the quiet, unassuming human standing amidst the carnage. "You," Garris breathed, his hands shaking. He swallowed hard, trying to project a semblance of control. "Do you have any idea who I am? I own the Traverse." Kevin slowly lowered his pistol, letting it hang by his side. "You were given 60 seconds, Garris." Garris sneered, reaching into his armored coat and pulling out a heavy, blocky detonator. His thumb hovered over the primary switch. "I'm not leaving without my prize. You think you've won? This detonator is linked directly to the Bloodhound's primary fusion reactor. You take 1 step toward me, I overload the core. It'll vaporize my ship, your ship, and every miserable soul in a 5-mile radius. Drop the gun." Cobb panicked. "Marshal, wait! He'll do it! The Bloodhound has a Class A reactor. It'll crack this asteroid cluster in half." Kevin did not drop his weapon. He didn't even blink. He simply tilted his head, regarding Garris with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. "A dead man's switch linked to your fusion core," Kevin said softly. "A standard Corsair contingency. Effective against naval patrols and rival syndicates." "Then you know I'm not bluffing," Garris spat, sweat pouring down his pale face. "Drop the gun, Terran." Kevin reached into his coat pocket with his free hand. He pulled out a small, cracked data pad. It belonged to the pirate he had interrogated in the server room. "When I asked your lieutenant for your comms frequency," Kevin said, his voice deadly calm, "I didn't just want to talk to you. The Bloodhound uses a retrofitted Orion-class network. It's notoriously susceptible to external administrative overrides if you have a localized access node, like an officer's data pad." Garris's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "Press the button, Garris," Kevin challenged, taking a slow step forward. Garris gritted his teeth. "I'll kill us all. Press it." With a scream of frustrated rage, Garris slammed his thumb down on the detonator. Nothing happened. No alarms. No catastrophic meltdown. just the quiet hum of the Corsica's failing life support. "I initiated a hard shutdown of your reactor 4 minutes ago," Kevin stated, raising his pistol. "Your ship is a tomb." Garrus stared at the detonator in horror. He let out a primal yell and raised his revolver, aiming squarely at Kevin's chest. Kevin fired once. The kinetic round shattered Garrus's knee. The pirate captain screamed, collapsing to the floor, his revolver clattering away. Garrus clutched his ruined leg, sobbing in agony. Kevin walked over, his boots splashing softly in the pooling blood. He looked down at the architect of so much suffering in the outer rims. Garrus looked up, his eyes filled with the exact terror he had inflicted on countless innocents. "Please," Garrus begged, coughing up blood. "I can pay you, whatever Earth wants. I have credits, I have salvage." Kevin crouched down, retrieving Garrus's dropped revolver. He expertly popped the cylinder, emptied the rounds into his hand, and tossed the useless gun aside. "I don't work for Earth anymore," Kevin said quietly. "And I am not a passenger." Kevin stood up, turning his back on the pirate captain. He looked at Captain Cobb. "The bloodhound is dead in the water, Captain," Kevin said, his voice returning to its mild, unassuming tone. "Their airlock is still tethered to ours. They have operational escape pods, medical supplies, and enough refined promethium to repair your drive core. I suggest your crew gets to work. I will be in my cabin." Cobb simply stared, mouth agape, nodding slowly. Kevin turned and walked out of the mess hall, leaving Garrus bleeding on the floor for the crew to deal with. 2 weeks later, the Corsica touched down on the terraformed surface of New Calum. The sky was a brilliant, unblemished blue, and the air smelled of blooming synthetic flora and clean rain. The voyage following the incident in the Traverse had been completely silent. The crew did not mock Kevin. They did not shoulder check him in the halls. Torres had personally ensured the coolant line near cabin 4 was repaired, and Griggs delivered a hot, high-quality meal to Kevin's door every evening, leaving it with a respectful bow of his head. They understood now. The 4 ingots of palladium hadn't been payment for a ticket. They had been payment for their silence. Kevin walked down the loading ramp, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, wearing the same faded wool coat. The station port was bustling with colonists, traders, and families. Captain Cobb stood at the bottom of the gantry. He held the lockbox containing the final ingot of palladium. "Mr. Marshall," Cobb said, his voice hushed and deeply respectful. He held out the box. Kevin took it, slipping it into his bag. "Thank you for the passage, Captain. We owe you our lives," Cobb stammered. "The authorities found Garrus bound in the mess hall. The bounty on his head paid off the Corsica's debts 10 times over. I don't know what you were, Kevin, but thank you." Kevin offered a small, genuine smile, the first Cobb had seen. "I'm just a father, Captain. Have a safe journey home." Kevin turned and walked into the crowd. Cobb watched him go, a ghost disappearing into the sea of humanity. Near the transit hub, a young woman with bright eyes and a familiar stubborn set to her jaw was waiting. She saw the graying man in the wool coat, and her face lit up. "Dad," Abigail Marshall called out, running forward and wrapping her arms around him. Kevin dropped his bag, catching his daughter in a tight, desperate embrace. The cold, mechanical killer of the Vesper Traverse vanished entirely, replaced by a weary man who had finally found his way back to the light. "I missed you, Abby," Kevin whispered, burying his face in her shoulder. "I missed you too," she said, pulling back to look at him. She frowned slightly, brushing a speck of dried rust from his collar. "How was the flight? You didn't take one of those awful budget haulers, did you?" Kevin smiled, picking up his bag and wrapping an arm around her shoulder as they walked toward the city. "It was fine, sweetheart," the Wraith replied softly. "Very quiet. If you enjoyed this descent into the Vesper Traverse and the terrifying awakening of Earth's Apex Division, let us know. Hit that like button to fuel the algorithm. Share this story with your fellow sci-fi junkies, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY tales, dark sci-fi dramas, and stories where humanity proves exactly why we own the stars. Drop a comment below. Would you have given Kevin a ride? Until next time, stay safe out in the void.